aside from wind, solar power is looked upon to be one of the main sources of new clean energy as set forth in our state's energy master plan. So we had Jim Spano from Spano Partners set to be speaking here today in person. I got a note earlier that Jim fell ill, but one of his associates, Lyle Rawlings, has agreed to give Jim's presentation, but he's going to be doing it virtually. I'll just mention that Spano Partners holding companies are now recognized as some of the top privately owned utility scale and C&I alternative energy developers and financiers in New Jersey. I do not have Lyle's biography. If he wants to give a couple of sentences about his background, he can. Otherwise, Lyle, the stage is all yours.
Okay, thank you, Ray. And I apologize that I can't be there in person. This was kind of last minute, but glad to be here. And I'll say at the outset, I'm particularly glad to be following on my friend Rick Thigpen at PSE&G because New Jersey, uniquely among the states in the US, has had less of an adversarial relationship with utility companies and a more cooperative relationship, especially with PSE&G, where there's been substantial cooperation between the solar industry and PSE&G over the years, and that has borne fruit for the solar industry. And we recognize that to get done with this renewable energy transition and meet the requirements of the Clean Energy Act of 2018 and the Energy Master Plan at 100% by 2050, we need healthy utilities, financially healthy utilities to get there. Cannot get there without that. Although when I say that in solar industry gatherings nationally, I get mocked and I get called all kinds of very impolite names. So New Jersey is lucky to have established that more cooperative relationship. And we hope to double down on that and make this renewable energy transition something that is good for utility companies. A couple of elements of what I'll present will typify that spirit. So as Ray said, I'm Lyle Rawlings. I serve as the president of the Mid-Atlantic Solar and Storage Industries Association, which represents the interests of the solar businesses in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, and has been dedicated for 25 years, not only to advancing solar energy, but to doing it at the lowest possible cost to ratepayers. I also serve as president and CEO of Advanced Solar Products, which develops large-scale solar plants and microgrids in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast regions. So I'm going to share my screen at this point. All right, so what I'll be talking about today will be a little bit of informational slides about proposed new federal incentives. This would be in the reconciliation package that Rick Thigpen just mentioned, which is called the Build Back Better Act. And then the new state incentives embodied in the recently begun Solar Successor Incentive Program, sometimes called the SUSI program. I'm going to present some studies, both by the federal government and by Mid-Atlantic SEIA, about the affordability of this transition to renewable energy. And I know that's much on the minds of businesses and policymakers and really everyone in the state. How affordable is a transition to 100% renewables by 2050? And then a little bit about what's next. What do we have to do, particularly in terms of solar development, to keep that transition going? So first on the federal incentives, the Build Back Better Act has a lot in it for the solar industry and for renewables as a whole, and other types of decarbonization technologies such as carbon capture were included in that as well. The current status is changing a lot. You've probably been reading a lot about that in the papers. And we have a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. that's telling us that a former linchpin of the Democratic plans to fight climate change was something called the CEPP, or Clean Electricity Payment Program, That is looking like it's not going to make it, that is likely to get dropped from the bill. And as you all probably know, the Build Back Better Act started out as a roughly 3.5 trillion package, not only of climate change, but social spending, a lot of different things in that package. That 3.5 billion is looking like it's going to get trimmed by something close to half, that something at or under 2 trillion is where it's likely to end up. And we were just on a call with our lobbyist in which he said he expects that that top line number, what the spending is going to be, is likely to be finalized over the weekend or at the latest Monday. So we'll have a top line, and what's going to happen then is it's going to go back to the committees to start to do the trimming that's going to be required for any programs that aren't cut entirely. But with the Clean Energy Pilot Program likely being dropped, from what we're hearing, more of the emphasis is going to go into tax credits likely, and the tax credits are very substantial. Key things are the federal investment tax credit for renewable energy properties. If the property is under 1 megawatt or it complies with prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, will go from 26% to 30%. And there's 3 different kinds of bonus credits that are in the current draft that came out of Ways and Means. And that includes an additional bonus credit for domestic content, which is yet to be defined, but it is stated in the law that in the bill that it will take into account current trade agreements of the U.S., international trade agreements. So it looks like that could be somewhat flexible. So that's one bonus credit. There's another bonus credit for an energy property that's built in a low-income community, and another low-income bonus credit that's higher if the energy property is built on a low-income building or is classified as a low-income economic benefit project, one example of which appears to be community solar projects, which are going like gangbusters in New Jersey. So these are all very good for solar developers and are going to bring far more federal dollars into the state. A lot of federal dollars being invested here in creating jobs. It's a good thing. This is another slide showing that the production tax credit, which is used less by solar and more by wind, is also being improved. And this is actually the slide on what I was just talking about, the increases in the investment tax credit. But one more very key issue on that is that the bill currently contains, and we are currently expecting to survive, a provision that makes the ITC refundable. And basically that means if you don't have enough tax liability to use up the investment tax credit, you may elect to take it as refundable, meaning that whatever you don't use up gets paid back to you as a check from the IRS. That is an absolute game changer for how the solar industry is going to work and finance projects. It opens up far more flexibility, absolute game changer. The investment, the refundable credit, in order to be eligible beyond year 3, is also going to require domestic content. So now that's about it for federal. I know I have a limited amount of time, so I'm going to move on to the state incentive program. I won't go too far into detail about this, but the bottom line message is that the Solar Successor Program followed on to the transition program, which was in place for about 2 years. And compared to the transition program, also known as the TREC program, the Successor Solar Incentive Program, which will use an incentive called the SREC 2, is a substantial decrease in incentives compared to the incentive program. In fact, for certain sectors, the solar industry is very concerned about certain sectors being non-viable with the new incentives. However, the new federal incentives, if that bill passes, could help those impaired sectors still survive and even grow. So a typical example that would be in probably the most active sector, which is commercial rooftops, is we're going from $152 per megawatt hour as the incentive. If you can see my cursor, I'm circling that now. That goes down to from 152 down to 100 for small projects and down to 90 for large projects. But if it's on a public entity facility, you get an extra $20 per megawatt hour. And that's across the board, that extra 20 for public projects, except for community solar. Residential solar, which is really the largest sector overall, and the one that creates the most jobs and puts the benefits most in the hands of homeowners and taxpayers, voters. That is at a level that we feel is too low, but I have to say that part of the solar industry, the local small businesses, they're tough New Jerseyans and they're surviving, but they're very much going to need the boost from the new tax credits if the Build Back Better Act is able to pass. And community solar, extremely active. The BPU is currently working on making that program move from a pilot program to a permanent program. So there now will not be a third-year pilot. They're going to move instead directly to the permanent community solar program. And the development community has been going gangbusters in community solar. They're getting something like 5 to 8 times more applications for community solar awards than they've got space for so far. So that build out is happening fast. The plan of the state in the Energy Master Plan and in the BPU's final capstone report calls for solar to continue its historical level of development of about 400 megawatts per year and start ramping up after the next year or two, eventually roughly 5 or 6 years from now, hitting 1,000 megawatts a year and continuing at that level until solar fulfills its Energy Master Plan destiny as a major supplier of power in this state. What few people realize is how big it already is. On an annual basis, on a pure energy basis, solar is currently approaching about 6% of the total energy used in this state. But on sunny, cool days, such as we've had the last few days, at peak, in the period from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., solar is supplying 25 to 30% of the state's power. And that's just an astounding figure, and it's going to be an element in what I need to talk about next, or shortly anyway, which is how are we going to get the infrastructure to handle all this solar power, not to mention all the offshore wind that we're going to build, which is enormous. But before I get to the infrastructure that we need, infrastructure costs a lot of money, and so do the state incentives. So there's a question, I think, that's on everybody's mind, which is, can we afford a clean energy future? And because this question affects our industry a lot, we've studied the question quite a lot, and many others. There have been major studies, federal and state kind of studies on this affordability question. But the first thing we studied is, where are we now? Before we talk about where are these costs going to go, building out massive amounts of solar, massive amounts of wind, electric vehicles, energy efficiency, class 1 renewables, all of these costs, where are we starting from relative to the rest of the country? And the answers are somewhat surprising. our mini study on the cost of electricity in New Jersey started out with rates, but people don't pay rates, people pay bills. And the bills, of course, are the rates times the consumption. So when we first look at rates alone, it turns out that New Jersey ranks 10th in the nation, and surprisingly is the lowest of its neighbors to the north, compared to Northeast, other states. All the other ones, except for Maine, have higher rates than we do, and they all have booming economies. So even if you only look at rates, we're not doing that badly. But when you look at bills, fortunately, New Jersey is among the most efficient states. It has one of the lowest usages of energy per capita. So when you look at per capita expenditures on electricity, in other words, bills, New Jersey is actually below average. It ranks 30th out of the 50 states plus DC. In other words, it's on the low end of the scale in terms of expenditures per capita, i.e. bills, because of its high efficiency already. Now, New Jersey is also a high income state. So when you look at affordability in terms of the percent of personal income spent on electricity per capita, New Jersey ranks near the bottom, surprisingly. It ranks 45th out of the 50 states plus DC, where the national average percent of personal income spent on electricity is 0.79%. In New Jersey, the percent of personal income spent on electricity is 0.61%. So it's on the low end of the poll in terms of percent of income. So that's the good news. We're not doing too badly. And as Ralph Fizzo has said in his public talks, the cost of electricity in New Jersey really has not risen in the last 20 years. We're in decent shape, and that's including very substantial costs for past solar programs. Now, thank goodness, we're done with those past solar programs, and we've gone to a much, much lower cost solar incentive program. But the cost of that program, those older programs, the legacy programs, is still with us and is going to be with us for the next 7 or 8 years. And then thankfully, those will tail off and go away, presenting some savings that we can work off of. But where we are now already includes substantial costs for solar. And we went from there to say, what's going to happen in the next 9 years as we go to the required 50% by 2030 that is in the Clean Energy Act. And further, what's going to happen in the next 20 years as we go to 2050, where the EMP says we're going to be at 100% renewable electricity. Well, first I'll say on this slide, it shows the results of a very recent study that's a national one that was published by the US Department of Energy called the Solar Future Study. And it concluded, and this is a quote, "A renewable-based grid will create significant health and cost savings. And in terms of costs, it said that it will result in a savings of $1.1 trillion to $1.7 trillion, far outweighing the costs." That's according to the federal government. Now, we at MCIA conducted a study on 2012 that used the most respected national consultant on valuation of solar power. What are the values that it delivered? And that this is Clean Power Research, headquartered in California. That study, entitled "The Value of Distributed Solar Electric Generation to New Jersey and Pennsylvania," concluded that the attribute value, this is over and above the energy value of it, the attribute value was $170 per megawatt hour. Now, if you compare that to what I just presented on what we're paying in incentives, which is around $90 or $100 per megawatt hour, clearly the value outstrips what we're paying for it. But we went further and we did a mini study. I have to say this was not a rigorous study, and it also is projecting costs into the future, which is also always a dicey undertaking. So this has to be regarded as approximate and necessarily entailing a fair amount of guesswork. But our our study, which was the cost, benefits, and rate impacts of green energy programs from 2021 all the way through 2050, found that if we take everything in green energy, the old solar programs, the new solar programs, the cost of the nuclear ZECs, the cost of class 1 renewables, the cost of infrastructure upgrades that we have to do to make ready the grid for renewables, the cost of energy efficiency programs, and even electric vehicle infrastructure. All of these green costs combined, it turns out, barely move the needle on rates, even if we just focus on rates alone and don't count any of the countervailing savings, but just the cost, the raw cost alone. Average between now and 2050 is only adding about 0.02 cents per kilowatt hour to our rates. Now, if we start talking about the opposite side of the equation, there are electric market benefits that were studied by Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory and others, showing that solar and wind are going to depress wholesale prices, especially in the middle of the day when they're usually the highest. In fact, what's happened in Germany, California, and other places shows that the times when previously power was going to be most expensive, like afternoons, especially in the summer, are now going to be when they're lowest, because the massive amounts of solar power are depressing usage so much during the middle of the day. That takes a big hunk out of the cost of wholesale power. And just that alone, just that one savings, is more than all of the cost of all those incentives, nuclear, solar, everything, and resulting in a slight decrease in rates. Now, if we take other savings, such as the energy efficiency, which can take a big chunk out of people's bills, because there's, as Rick Thigpen said, there's a lot of opportunity in energy efficiency, and it's the cheapest, best thing to do. When you take into that account, consumers' bills are going to drop considerably between now and the year 2050. And then we get into the social cost of carbon. Those are massive savings. And the avoided social cost of criteria pollutants, which is the local cost of health and other environmental damage. When we take all of that into account, then you're talking about very, very substantial savings for ratepayers all the way every year from now through 2050. So the good news here is, yes, we can afford to make this transition to renewable energy, and there will be substantial net savings to consumers. And that's not to mention the jobs and economic growth and the injection of federal monies into the state that will result. We think that's cause for celebration. And so we hope that the state continues on course. And so the next question is, what's next? The number one priority for the solar industry now is working on the infrastructure. Unfortunately, the state made a decision very recently that when it comes to electric vehicles, in the law and in the straw proposals coming out of the BPU, the utilities are going to be made responsible to make ready the grid for electric vehicles. It's going to be responsible for strengthening the distribution system where necessary. It's going to be responsible for extending the grid to electric vehicle chargers. And the utilities are going to be able to recover those costs through the rate base. To us, inexplicably, that is not the case for solar. And this is something we need to do. And I can't emphasize this enough. We cannot get to the 2030 goals, and we most assuredly cannot get to the 2050 goals without this being done. The utilities must be empowered to make the investment in infrastructure to make ready the grid for renewables. And of course, doing that, they must be able to recover those costs from the rate base. So that's our question for New Jersey policymakers. If this is already the case for electric vehicles, why isn't it for solar? The Successor program is already ongoing. It's a very well-designed program, other than, as I said, we believe that certain sectors were critically under incentivized. Hopefully, if we get the new tax credits out of Washington, D.C., that will be made okay. And then the second phase of that is going to be a competitive solicitation for very large-scale solar, which is expected to start early next year. Another thing coming up, the state in the Clean Energy Act was required to come up with a battery incentive program to meet a requirement of 2,000 megawatts of batteries by the year 2030. We're kind of behind in getting that done. We hope that accelerates, and we are expecting the BPU soon to release the proposed battery incentive program and a stakeholder process for that, which we also hope that either through that or through other means, we get a statewide program to encourage microgrids. Why? If we're going to do a renewable energy transition, we need storage. Renewable energy, the ones we have, solar and wind, are intermittent, so we have to have storage to make it work. And storage costs a lot. So if we're going to pay all this money for storage, let's make it do double duty and increase the resiliency of our township buildings, our water and sewer treatment facilities, our fire, police, hospitals, even gas stations, supermarkets. These places are going to need microgrids in order to do that resiliency. So we can make these storage dollars do double duty. And microgrids are going to become even more necessary in the future as we electrify transportation. Because what happens in a Hurricane Sandy if we're out of power for a week or 2 weeks and our vehicles are electric vehicles? Are we going to lose mobility? That would be very dangerous. So a lot of places are going to need microgrids in order to keep the mobility going, keep the especially heavy duty electric vehicles like school buses, garbage trucks, ambulances, that sort of thing. So I think we're going to see microgrids expand very, very rapidly. And lastly, and on the same note, and this is my last slide, electric vehicles are going to be an enormous grid asset. Another mini study by us showed that by the time we've fulfilled the legal requirement for vehicles in 2025, I believe, at 330,000 vehicles, and furthermore, by 2030, the requirement for, I'm sorry, but I believe it's 30% electric vehicles, that represents about 200,000 megawatt hours of capacity. And when you compare that with the stationary battery requirement of 200,000 versus 2,000, that's an enormous amount of storage that's going to be rolling around on wheels, but plugged in 96% of the time. So it's absolutely essential that we start to pay attention to that existing, or what will exist as enormous battery capacity. We've got to enable that rolling battery capacity to do its job as a grid asset and help stabilize the grid in the future. And going back to what I said at the beginning, much of this is going to require healthy utilities to invest in a lot of these features, not only investing in the infrastructure, but also controlling it in a much more sophisticated way. That's why we need healthy utility companies, and we need a partnership between the solar industry and the utility companies if we're going to make this happen. And thank you.
Lyle, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time for questions, but I will just suggest if anyone does have questions to send them along to me. I will forward them to Lyle, and we'll see if we get them answered. But Lyle, thanks again, and thanks, Jim, and tell him I hope he feels better.
I will. Thank you, Ray.